Rain stripped grease from the cracked asphalt outside an all-night diner. A tiny fist hammered against tinted bulletproof glass. Inside sat Leo, nursing lukewarm coffee, knuckles bruised, his mind numb from a decade of burying friends. Small, frantic sobs pierced the muffled jazz playing from the jukebox. "Men are hurting my mama," a child's voice cracked through the glass, high and desperate. Leo didn't move immediately. He wasn't a savior. Yet those small hands clawed at his conscience. Rainwater tasted like exhaust fumes and stale cigarettes. Leo knew this because a drop had managed to slip past the heavy wool of his collar, trailing down the side of his neck to settle bitterly on his lips. He sat in the corner booth of Sal's, staring at a plate of cold eggs that smelled faintly of ammonia. The diner was a neon-lit purgatory, humming with the low-frequency vibration of a failing generator. He was exhausted. Not the kind of tired that a few hours of sleep could fix, but a deep, marrow-aching fatigue. He had spent the last 48 hours untangling a logistical nightmare at the docks, dealing with men who smiled while calculating the exact cost of a bullet to the back of his head. Then came the tapping. At first, it was a rhythm so light it blended with the rain hitting the reinforced glass. Leo ignored it. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the oily buildup of sweat and stress on his skin. But the tapping grew frantic. It evolved into a desperate slapping of small palms against the wet window. Leo turned his head slowly. The vertebrae in his neck popped. Through the distortion of the rain and the thick glass, he saw her. A child, no older than 6, wearing a yellow raincoat that was entirely too big for her. The sleeves were rolled up in thick, clumsy cuffs. Her face was smeared with mud and something darker. Her eyes, wide and terrified, locked onto his. "Men are hurting my mama." The sound barely penetrated the heavy glass, reaching him as a muffled, reedy squeak. Leo's jaw tightened. He looked away, shifting his gaze back to his ruined eggs. Not my problem. The city was full of problems. The city was a rotting carcass, and the maggots were always hungry. You didn't stop to save a fly from a spiderweb when you owned the spider, but the crying didn't stop. It hitched, a wet, gasping sound that vibrated through the pain and seemed to settle directly behind Leo's ribs. It was an irritating sensation, an itch. He slid out of the booth. The synthetic leather groaned under his weight. He didn't run. He didn't feel a sudden rush of heroic adrenaline. He felt profoundly annoyed. He tossed a crumpled $20 bill onto the sticky Formica table and pushed his way through the heavy glass door. The cold hit him instantly, biting through his tailored suit. The alley beside the diner was a black throat, reeking of rotting cabbage, wet cardboard, and the metallic tang of overflowing dumpsters. The only light came from the flickering amber street lamp swaying in the wind. He heard them before he saw them, the wet, meaty thwack of leather impacting flesh, a low, breathless whimper. A man's voice, rough and breathless, muttering a string of curses. Leo stepped into the mouth of the alley. His leather-soled shoes slipped slightly on the grease-coated cobblestones. He corrected his balance, feeling a twinge in his lower back. He was getting too old for street brawls. 2 men. Cheap leather jackets that smelled of cheap weed and wet dog. One of them had a fist twisted in the dark hair of a woman, crumpled on the ground. The other was drawing his foot back for another kick to her ribs. "Hey!" Leo said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a flat, gravelly baritone that cut through the rain. The men froze, turning toward him. The one holding the woman's hair squinted into the gloom. "Get lost, suit." This ain't your business." Leo sighed. His breath plumed in the freezing air. He didn't draw the heavy Smith & Wesson holstered under his arm. Firing a gun drew cops, and cops meant paperwork. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance with a deceptive, rolling gait. The kicker lunged first, throwing a wide, uncoordinated right hook. Leo didn't block it. He simply stepped inside the arc of the swing, feeling the wind of the fist brush his ear. He drove his elbow straight up into the man's jaw. There was a sickening crunch, like stepping on dry kindling. The man's teeth clicked together violently, and his eyes rolled back. He dropped like a sack of wet cement, his head bouncing once against the pavement with a hollow thud. The second man let go of the woman, his hand scrambling toward his waistband. A knife. The blade caught the amber street lamp, flashing dull silver. Leo felt a spike of adrenaline, acidic and sharp, burn the back of his throat. He stepped into a puddle, the icy water soaking his sock. The man lunged, thrusting the knife toward Leo's gut. Leo twisted, feeling the sharp pull of a muscle in his oblique. The blade sliced through the wool of his coat, a clean, hissing sound. Annoyance flared into a brief, blinding anger. Leo grabbed the man's wrist, his thick fingers digging into the tendons until the bone ground against bone. The man screamed, a high-pitched, pathetic sound, and dropped the knife. It clattered into the grate of a storm drain. Leo didn't let go. He twisted the wrist further, stepping behind the man and kicking the back of his knee. As the thug buckled, Leo shoved him face first into the brick wall. The impact was wet and heavy. The brick scraped a layer of skin off the man's cheek, leaving a raw, weeping smear of red. The thug crumpled into a heap next to the overflowing dumpster, whimpering into a pile of wet newspapers. Leo stood there for a moment, breathing heavily. His chest heaved, and he could feel the cold rain pasting his shirt to his back. His knuckles throbbed. He looked at his coat. A 4-inch slash ruined the left panel. A bespoke suit, ruined for a street mugging. He turned his attention to the ground. The woman was curled into a tight fetal position, her arms wrapped around her head. She was shivering violently, her breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "Get up," Leo said, his voice flat. She didn't move. Leo wiped a mixture of rain and sweat from his forehead. He squatted down, his knees popping in protest. Up close, he could smell her. A mixture of cheap vanilla perfume, stale sweat, and the sharp, unmistakable metallic odor of fresh blood. Her face was hidden behind a curtain of wet, matted hair. "I said get up," he repeated, reaching out to grasp her shoulder. She flinched violently, swatting blindly at his hand. Her fingernails caught his wrist, leaving 3 stinging scratches. "Don't touch me," she hissed, her voice cracked and raw. She finally lifted her head. Her right eye was already swelling shut, the skin around it puffing into an angry, purple mound. Her lip was split, a sluggish trail of dark red leaking down her chin. But it was her good eye that caught him. It wasn't an eye filled with gratitude. It was furious. It was the eye of a cornered, stray dog deciding whether to bite or bolt. Before Leo could respond, small, rapid footsteps splashed through the puddles. The little girl in the yellow raincoat collided with the woman, burying her face into her mother's neck. "Mama! Mama!" The woman's defensive posture melted instantly. She wrapped her arms around the child, pulling her tight. "I'm okay, Lily. I'm okay. Don't look." Leo stood up slowly, feeling the damp cold seeping into his bones. He looked down at the two of them. They looked pathetic. They looked like a complication. He should turn around, walk to his car, and drive back to his heavily guarded penthouse. He had survived this long by not bringing strays home. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his lighter. He pulled out his keys instead. "My car is at the end of the block," Leo said, his tone devoid of warmth. "If you stay here, they're going to wake up, and I am not fighting them twice." He turned and started walking toward the street, his ruined coat flapping in the wind. He didn't look back to see if they were following, But over the sound of the rain and the distant sirens, he heard the wet squeak of rubber boots and the dragging shuffle of the woman's ruined heels on the asphalt. The interior of Leo's armored Lincoln Town car smelled of aged leather, expensive mints, and gunpowder. It was a sterile, controlled environment. The temperature was set to a precise 70 degrees. The air filtered through HEPA systems to keep the grime of the city out. Now, it smelled like wet wool, copper, and fear. Leo watched them through the rear-view mirror as he navigated the slick, black streets. Clara, she had mumbled her name when he practically shoved her into the back seat, was leaning against the window, her breath fogging the tinted glass. She held a wadded-up napkin from Sal's diner against her bleeding lip. The napkin was quickly soaking through, blooming with dark red patches. Beside her, the girl, Lily, sat rigid. She wasn't crying anymore. She was staring straight ahead, her small hands clutching a worn-out stuffed rabbit that was missing an ear and an eye. The rabbit looked almost as battered as her mother. "Don't bleed on the leather," Leo said. The words slipped out before he could stop them, cold and harsh. Clara's gaze snapped from the window to the back of his head. Even through the rearview mirror, he could see the venom in her good eye. She didn't apologize. She didn't thank him. She simply pressed the napkin harder against her mouth, her knuckles turning white. "Where are you taking us?" she demanded. Her voice trembled, but not entirely from the cold. There was a hard edge of suspicion there. "Somewhere you won't bleed to death," Leo replied, turning the heavy steering wheel with one hand. The wipers rhythmically slapped the rain away. Thwack, swoosh, thwack, swoosh. The sound was hypnotic, pulling Leo deeper into his own irritated thoughts. Why was he doing this? He was the head of the Rossi family. He commanded men who moved millions of dollars of illicit cargo across state lines. He ordered hits over cold espresso. He didn't play paramedic to alleyway trash. He glanced at Lily again. The kid hadn't blinked in a solid minute. She was staring directly at him through the mirror. Her gaze made him intensely uncomfortable. It was too direct, too hollow. "Turn around," Leo snapped, adjusting the mirror slightly to avoid her eyes. "Look out the window, kid." Lily slowly turned her head, her small hands squeezing the rabbit tighter. "Leave her alone," Clara hissed, leaning forward. The seatbelt locked, digging into her bruised ribs. She gasped, falling back against the headrest, a sudden sheen of sweat breaking out on her forehead. "You have 2 broken ribs. Maybe 3, Leo noted clinically. He took a sharp right turn, the tires hissing on the wet pavement. "Your breathing is shallow. You're bracing your left side." "Are you a doctor?" She spat. "I've broken enough ribs to know the sound." Silence descended on the car again, heavy and suffocating. The neon signs of the city blurred past. Cheap motels, liquor stores, pawnbrokers. Red and blue lights reflecting on the wet hood of the Lincoln. Leo reached for the phone built into the center console. He punched in a short sequence of numbers. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Yeah. Harrison, it's Leo. Open the back door." "It's 3 a.m, Leo. I'm closed." "Then open," Leo said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into the tone that made grown men sweat. "I'm 5 minutes away. Have the table ready." He hung up without waiting for a reply. "Who is Harrison?" Clara asked. Her voice was growing fainter. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind the crushing weight of physical trauma. "A veterinarian," Leo said, deadpan. Clara let out a short, bitter laugh that turned into a wet cough. "Perfect. Treat me like a dog." "Why not? Everyone else does." Leo didn't respond. He focused on the road. But her words gnawed at him. He gripped the steering wheel until his own knuckles ached. He hated vulnerability. He hated seeing it in others, and he hated feeling responsible for it. It reminded him too much of the weakness he had meticulously burned out of himself over the last 20 years. He pulled the Lincoln into a narrow alley behind the dilapidated pet supply store. The brick walls closed in around them, claustrophobic and dark. He killed the headlights. The engine idled with a low, powerful thrum. "We're here," he announced, putting the car in park. He stepped out into the rain again. It was coming down harder now, cold needles biting into his exposed skin. He opened the rear door. Clara was slumped against the door frame, her eyes half closed. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded weakly, trying to push herself up. Her arms gave out, and she slumped forward. Leo cursed under his breath. He reached in, sliding one arm behind her knees and the other around her shoulders. He hauled her out of the car. She felt terrifyingly light, like a bundle of hollow bones wrapped in a wet trench coat. Her head rolled against his chest. He smelled the cheap vanilla perfume again, mixed with the sharp scent of wet asphalt and iron. "Lily, grab my coat," Leo ordered, nodding toward the hem of his ruined jacket. "Don't let go." The little girl scrambled out of the car, her yellow boots splashing in a puddle. She grabbed a fistful of his wet wool coat, her grip surprisingly strong. Leo kicked the car door shut with his heel and carried Clara toward the heavy steel door at the back of the building. Before he could knock, the door swung open, revealing a wall of harsh, buzzing fluorescent light. The basement clinic smelled like bleach, old paper, and the distinct, dusty odor of dry dog food. It was a jarring combination. Doc Harrison stood in the doorway, wearing a stained white coat over a rumpled flannel shirt. He was a man who looked like he hadn't slept since the late 90s. Deep bags hung under his eyes, and a permanent scowl etched deep lines around his mouth. "Christ, Leo," Harrison muttered, stepping aside to let them in. "What did you hit her with?" "Not me," Leo grunted, carrying Clara past the stacks of dog crates toward the back room. "Alley rats." Harrison followed, his eyes darting to the little girl trailing behind, still clutching Leo's coat. "You brought a kid? Are you out of your mind? You know the rules." "Shut up and fix her," Leo snapped, laying Clara down on a cold, stainless steel examination table. The metal squeaked under her weight. Clara moaned, her eyes fluttering open. The harsh lights made her squint. She tried to sit up, her hands flailing wildly. "Hold her down," Harrison instructed, moving toward a metal tray covered in medical instruments. Leo grabbed her shoulders, pinning her flat. She fought him, her muscles tense and trembling, but she was exhausted. Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps. "Stop moving," Leo said, his voice low and steady. "He's a doctor." "Mostly." Clara stopped fighting, her chest heaving. She stared at the ceiling, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes, mixing with the blood drying on her cheeks. Harrison worked quickly. He was a drunk and a cynic, but his hands were steady when they needed to be. He cut away Clara's ruined shirt with trauma shears, revealing a canvas of deep purple and yellow bruises spreading across her ribcage. Leo turned away. He didn't want to look. He looked down at Lily instead. The girl was standing by a metal rolling cart, staring at a jar of cotton swabs. She looked small. Ridiculously small in this room, built for patching up gunshot wounds and knife fights. Leo sighed, the sound loud in the quiet room. He walked over to a small water cooler in the corner, grabbed a flimsy paper cone, and filled it with water. He walked back to the girl and held it out. "Here." Lily looked at the cup, then at his face. She didn't take it. "It's just water. It's not poisoned," Leo grumbled. She reached out slowly, her small, dirty fingers taking the cone. She took a tiny sip, her eyes never leaving his face. "Why are your hands red?" she asked. Her voice was surprisingly steady, lacking the panic from the alley. Leo looked down at his bruised knuckles. The skin was scraped raw, a thin layer of blood drying in the cracks. "I tripped," he lied. "You hit those men," she stated matter-of-factly. "You hit them hard." Leo frowned. He didn't like being analyzed by a 6-year-old. "They were hurting your mother." "I thought that's what you wanted." "They were going to kill her," Lily said softly, staring down at the water. "Victor said he was going to kill her." The name hit Leo like a physical blow. The air in the room seemed to freeze. He set his jaw, the muscle in his cheek ticking. He turned slowly back to the examination table. Harrison was taping a heavy bandage around Clara's ribs, muttering to himself about fractured bone and internal bleeding. Leo walked over, his heavy footsteps echoing on the linoleum. He stood over Clara. She looked up at him, her good eye wary. "Who did you borrow money from?" Leo asked. The tone of his voice had changed completely. It was no longer annoyed. It was terrifyingly calm. Clara licked her dry, cracked lips. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your kid just gave you up," Leo said coldly. "She said a name." "Victor." Clara's eyes widened in panic. She tried to sit up again, but Harrison pushed her gently back down. "Don't move, sweetheart. You'll pop a lung." "Don't hurt her," Clara pleaded, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "She doesn't know anything. She's just a kid." "I'm not going to hurt her," Leo said, leaning closer. He braced his hands on the edge of the metal table. "But I need you to tell me exactly which Victor you are talking about. Victor, as in Victor Volkov? Victor, as in the loan shark operating out of the meat-packing district?" Clara squeezed her eyes shut. A tear tracked through the grime on her cheek. She gave a slow, minute nod. Leo closed his eyes. He rubbed his temples, feeling a headache blooming behind his eyes, a sharp, throbbing pain that promised to last for days. Victor Volkov. Victor wasn't just a loan shark. Victor was a capo, a lieutenant in Leo's own syndicate. The men Leo had just beaten half to death in the alley were his own enforcers. He had just assaulted his own men to save a woman who owed his own organization money. "How much?" Leo asked, his voice a dangerous whisper. 30,000, Clara choked out. "My husband, he died last year. He had gambling debts. They transferred to me. I couldn't pay." $30,000. It was pocket change to Leo. He spent more than that on a weekend trip to Vegas. But to Victor, it was a matter of principle. Victor was a sadist. He enjoyed the collection process more than the money itself. "You're a dead woman," Leo stated flatly. It wasn't a threat. It was an objective observation. Clara let out a ragged sob, turning her face away from him. "I know. I wanted to get Lily out of the city. We were going to take a bus tonight. They found us at the diner." Leo stared at her. He looked at her bruised, pathetic form. He looked at the torn, cheap clothes. Then he looked back at the little girl, who was now quietly stroking the missing ear of her stuffed rabbit. He should leave. Right now, he could hand Clara over to Victor. It was the rules of the life. You didn't interfere with another man's ledger, especially not an underling who was already ambitious and looking for a reason to challenge the throne. Handing her back would be the smart play, the safe play. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his lighter. He flicked the lid open and closed. Clack, clack, clack. The metallic sound was rhythmic, grounding him. "Harrison," Leo said, not taking his eyes off Clara. "Yeah?" the doctor replied, wiping his hands on a bloody towel. "Keep them here tonight. Lock the doors. Don't answer the phone." Harrison stopped wiping his hands. He looked at Leo, his bloodshot eyes widening. "Leo, are you insane? If Victor finds out you're harboring a skip..." "He won't find out from you," Leo said softly, turning his dark gaze onto the doctor. Will he? Harrison swallowed hard. No. No, of course not. Leo turned on his heel and began walking toward the heavy metal door. Wait! Clara called out, her voice raspy. Who are you? Leo stopped with his hand on the cold iron handle. He looked down at his ruined suit, the slash in the coat, the blood on his cuffs. He thought about the delicate peace treaty he was currently managing, the millions of dollars at stake, the fragile empire he had built on blood and intimidation. And he thought about the heavy, uncomfortable itch behind his ribs that hadn't gone away since he heard the child's voice through the diner window. I'm the guy who just made a very stupid mistake, Leo said. He pushed the door open and stepped back, out into the freezing rain, the sound of the city's decay rushing up to greet him. The engine of the Lincoln was still running, a low, mechanical growl in the dark. He climbed into the driver's seat, the leather cold against his back. He didn't turn the headlights on right away. He sat in the dark, watching the water cascade down the windshield, feeling the heavy weight of the gun in his shoulder holster. He pulled out his phone. He dialed a number he knew by heart. Yeah, boss, a voice answered, sharp and alert despite the hour. It was Frankie, his right-hand man. Frankie, Leo said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. Wake up the boys. We have a problem in the meatpacking district. Victor? Frankie asked, a note of tension bleeding into his voice. Yeah, Victor. Leo paused, staring at the blurred red lights of a passing taxi in the distance. And Frankie? Yeah, boss. Cancel my tailor tomorrow. I need a new suit. He dropped the phone into the cup holder and finally turned on the headlights. The twin beams cut through the torrential rain, illuminating the trash and the rats, scattering into the shadows. He threw the heavy car into drive and pulled out of the alley, heading toward the neon glow of the skyline. The itch was gone, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. He had just declared war on his own house, all for a woman who smelled like vanilla and a kid with a broken toy. He hated himself for it, but as he pressed the accelerator to the floor, he knew he wasn't going to stop. Meatpacking plants at 4 a.m. possessed a specific, suffocating atmosphere. Ammonia burned the lining of the nostrils, layered over the heavy, sweet stench of raw pork and the metallic tang of frozen blood. Leo stood in the shadows of a loading dock, his breath pluming in the refrigerated air. He hated this district. It was loud, filthy, and stripped of the civilized veneer he preferred to drape over his operations. Beside him, Frankie racked the slide of a suppressed Glock 19. The mechanical click-clack sounded obscenely loud over the hum of the massive industrial freezers. Frankie was a broad-shouldered man who wore expensive cologne to mask the scent of his profession. Tonight, the cologne was losing the battle against the slaughterhouse. You sure about this, boss? Frankie asked. His voice was a low rumble, barely carrying over the machinery. Victor's going to take this personal. We hit his counting room. We're crossing a line. Victor crossed the line when he put his hands on a civilian in my territory. Leo lied smoothly. It was a justification, thin as ice, but necessary for the men to understand. You couldn't tell soldiers you were starting a war over a crying kid. You told them it was about respect, about territory. Leo checked the magazine of his own weapon. He didn't use a suppressor. If things went side, he wanted the noise. He wanted the terror. 3 men inside, Leo said, ignoring Frankie's hesitation. Counting the week's collections, in and out. Nobody dies unless they force it. But break their hands. I want Victor to know exactly who stopped his clock. Frankie nodded, his face hardening into a professional mask. He tapped the shoulder of the man behind him, a wiry enforcer named Thomas. They moved out of the shadows. The concrete floor was slick with condensation and frozen animal fat. Leo walked with a deliberate, heavy step. They approached the heavy steel door labeled Storage 4B. It wasn't locked. Victor's men were arrogant, insulated by the fear their boss commanded. Frankie kicked the door open. It slammed back against the cinder block wall with a sound like a bomb detonating. The room inside was small, brightly lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes. Stacks of bundled cash sat on a folding plastic table, flanked by ledgers and styrofoam cups of coffee. 3 men looked up, their expressions freezing in a comical mask of shock. They were low-level thugs, wearing heavy winter coats indoors. "Hands on the table!" Frankie roared, his suppressed weapon leveled at the chest of the largest man. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been older than 20, panicked. His hand darted toward his waistband. Leo didn't blink. He raised his heavy Smith & Wesson and fired a single shot into the ceiling. The roar of the unsuppressed .45 caliber gun in the enclosed space was deafening. Concrete dust rained down onto the stacks of dirty money. The kid froze, his hands snapping up to his ears as he dropped to his knees, whimpering. "I won't miss the second time," Leo said. The ringing in his own ears was a high, sustained whine. His voice was flat, devoid of adrenaline. The other 2 men slowly raised their hands, backing away from the table. The smell of urine suddenly mixed with the ammonia. The kid on the floor had lost control of his bladder. "Leo?" the largest man stammered, recognizing the boss of his own family standing in the doorway. "Boss, what is this?" "This is Victor's room." "I know," Leo said. He holstered his weapon and walked to the table. He picked up a bundle of 20s, the paper rough against his bruised knuckles. He tossed it back down. "Thomas, bag the ledgers. Leave the cash." Frankie shot Leo a confused look. "Leave the cash? We aren't thieves, Frankie. We're management," Leo corrected, his gaze fixed on Victor's men. "Tell Victor his books are being audited. Tell him his collections in the Lower East Side are suspended indefinitely." Leo stepped closer to the large man who had spoken. The man flinched, expecting a blow. Leo simply grabbed the man's right wrist, ignoring the sweat soaking the sleeve of his coat. With a sudden, vicious twist, he pinned the man's arm flat against the folding table. "Boss, wait! Please!" Leo brought the heavy, steel-capped heel of his shoe down directly onto the man's exposed hand. Bones snapped with the sound of dry branches breaking. The man screamed, a wet, ragged sound that bounced off the cinder block walls, falling to the floor and clutching his ruined hand to his chest. "Tell him," Leo repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, yet slicing perfectly through the man's agony, "that the Rossi family doesn't collect from widows in diners. It lacks class." He turned and walked out of the freezing room, the screams fading behind the heavy steel door. The cold air outside felt clean by comparison. He pulled out a sterile alcohol wipe from his pocket and meticulously cleaned his hands as he walked back to the armored Lincoln. His chest felt tight. The die was cast. By sunrise, Victor would know. By noon, the streets would be holding their breath. Fluorescent light in Harrison's basement clinic buzzed with a relentless, maddening inconsistency. It flickered every 10 seconds, throwing long, distorted shadows across the linoleum floor. Leo sat on a folding metal chair that dug into his lower back, staring at Clara. It had been 14 hours since the alley. She was burning up. Sweat plastered her dark hair to her forehead, and her skin held a pale, waxy sheen that made the dark, purple bruises on her face look even more grotesque. She mumbled incoherently, tossing her head from side to side. The cheap cot Harrison had moved her to squeaked with every restless movement. "Infection," Harrison muttered, standing by a stainless steel sink and scrubbing his hands with coarse orange soap. One of those cracked ribs punctured the tissue. "Nasty. I've pumped her full of broad-spectrum antibiotics, but her immune system is shot. Malnourished, stressed. She's running on fumes, Leo. Keep her alive, Leo said. He didn't look at the doctor. He watched Clara's chest rise and fall in shallow, ragged hitches. I'm a vet, not a miracle worker. If her fever doesn't break by midnight, she needs a real hospital. She goes to a hospital. Victor's cops find her in the system. She's dead. Leo finally turned his gaze to Harrison. It was a dead, uncompromising look. Keep her alive here, Harrison sighed, drying his hands on a towel that had seen better decades. He walked over and checked the IV drip taped to Clara's bruised arm. You're getting soft, boss. Or crazy. Burning down Victor's counting house for a stray? The entire commission is going to be asking questions. Let them ask. Leo stood up. The small room felt suffocating. He needed a cigarette, but the oxygen tanks in the corner made it a death wish. He unbuttoned the collar of his spare shirt, a stiff, ill-fitting white button-down Frankie had fetched from a safe house. He felt grimy. He felt out of control. He walked out into the small waiting area of the clinic. The shelves were stocked with dusty flea collars and brightly colored bags of kibble. Sitting cross-legged on a stack of dog beds was Lily. She was staring at a muted television mounted in the corner, playing some daytime soap opera. She still had her yellow rain boots on, though the coat was draped over a chair. She looked up when Leo walked in. Is she going to die? Lily asked. There was no childish naivety in her voice. It was a pragmatic question, born from a life that had already taught her too much about loss. Leo stopped. He shoved his hands into his pockets. No, you don't know that, Lily countered, her eyes dropping back to the television. My dad went to sleep and didn't wake up. He was sweating just like Mama. Leo felt a strange, cold tightness in his throat. He wasn't equipped for this. He negotiated with sociopaths and killers. He didn't soothe traumatized children. He walked over to a vending machine in the corner, the hum of its compressor loud in the quiet room. He fed a crumpled dollar bill into the slot, punched a button, and caught a packet of stale cheese crackers as it fell. He walked over and tossed the packet onto the dog bed next to her. Eat, he commanded gently. Lily looked at the crackers, then up at him. She carefully opened the plastic, the crinkling sound sharply defining the silence. She took a tiny bite. Why are you staying here? She asked, her mouth half full. You look like you want to leave. Leo pulled up a plastic chair and sat down facing her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I want to be in my own bed, drinking a scotch that costs more than this building. Yes. So go. I can't. Why? Because, Leo paused, searching for the words. He couldn't explain mafia politics to a child. He couldn't explain the concept of honor among thieves, especially when it was mostly a lie anyway. Because I started something, and I have to make sure it finishes the right way. Lily seemed to accept this. She offered him a cracker. He stared at the orange, processed square sitting in her small, grubby palm. He hated processed food. He took it anyway, snapping it in half and eating it. It tasted like cardboard and salt. His burner phone vibrated in his pocket, a harsh, grinding buzz. He pulled it out. Caller ID was blocked. He stood up, walking toward the back hallway. Stay here. Eat the rest of those. He swiped the screen and held the phone to his ear. Speak, Leo. The voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with a quiet, dangerous amusement. Victor Volkov. I hear you've been remodeling my offices. Leo's jaw tightened. Your men were sloppy, Victor. Their accounting was off. I corrected it. Is that so? Victor chuckled. The sound was like a blade sliding over a whetstone. They tell me you left the cash, took the books, broke a man's hand over. What was it? A widow? Your enforcers were beating a woman to death in an alley for a $30,000 debt. Leo kept his voice entirely level. It draws attention. It's bad for business. Since when do you care about the optics of collection, Leo? You've buried men for less. Victor paused. The silence on the line was heavy, pregnant with a threat. Rumor has it, you took the woman with you, and her brat. Now, why would the boss of the Rossi family play white knight for a piece of trash that owes me money? She doesn't owe you anything anymore, Leo said. The debt is absorbed by the house. Stand down, Victor. The debt is mine. Victor's voice dropped the amusement. It became cold, hard steel. And no one, not even you, walks into my house, breaks my toys and steals my property. You're getting old, Leo. Your judgment is failing. If you have a grievance, bring it to the sit-down on Friday, Leo countered. But if you step out of line before then, if you send men looking for her, I won't just break their hands. I'll send them back to you in pieces. He hung up, ending the call before Victor could reply. He crushed the cheap plastic burner phone in his hand until the screen cracked, throwing it into a nearby trash can. The war hadn't just started. It had just gone nuclear. He walked back into the examination room. Harrison was asleep in a chair, his head thrown back, snoring softly. On the metal cot, Clara was quiet. Leo approached her slowly. The frantic tossing had stopped. Her breathing was deeper, more regular. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before he pressed the back of his fingers against her forehead. Her skin was cool, damp, but cool. The fever had broken. Clara shifted at his touch. Her good eye fluttered open. The pupil was blown wide, disoriented. She blinked several times, trying to focus on the large, shadowy figure standing over her. You, she croaked. Her throat sounded like sandpaper. Leo grabbed a plastic cup of water and a straw, holding it to her lips. She drank greedily, coughing as the water hit the back of her throat. Slow down, he muttered, pulling the cup away. She collapsed back onto the thin pillow, her chest heaving. She looked around the grim, fluorescent-lit room, then back at him. Memory seemed to crash over her like a physical weight. Lily! Where is Lily? She tried to sit up, a sharp hiss of pain escaping her lips as her broken ribs protested. She's fine. She's in the other room watching television, Leo said, pressing a firm hand against her shoulder to keep her down. Don't move. You'll undo the doctor's tape. Clara stared at his hand on her shoulder. He was wearing a stark white shirt, his cuffs rolled up, exposing thick forearms scarred by years of violence. She looked up at his face. The harsh lighting cast deep shadows under his eyes. He looked exhausted, dangerous, and completely out of place. Why are we here? She whispered. Why didn't you let them finish it? Because your kid has a loud voice, and I had a headache, Leo said dryly, pulling his hand back and crossing his arms. That's a lie, Clara said. Her voice was weak, but the defiance from the alley was returning. Men like you don't do things for nothing. What do you want from me? Leo let out a short, cynical bark of laughter. It held zero humor. What do I want from you? You have $30,000 in debt, 2 broken ribs and a kid in yellow boots. You have nothing I want. Then why? She demanded, coughing again, a wet, painful sound. Leo stepped closer to the cot. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. He could smell the stale sweat, the medical tape, and beneath it all, the faint, persistent scent of vanilla. Because, Leo said softly, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room, the man you owe money to is a rabid dog, and I am the man who holds his leash. And last night, I decided I didn't like how he was barking." Clara's breath hitched. Her eye widened as the realization hit her. She wasn't saved by a random good Samaritan. She was pulled from the frying pan directly into the fire. You're his boss," she whispered, horror draining the little color she had regained. "My name is Leo Rossi," he stated coldly. "And right now, you are the most dangerous piece of leverage in this city, which means you belong to me until I say otherwise." Morning bled into the city like a dirty secret, grey and relentless. Rain had turned to a thick, clinging mist that settled over the streets, muffling the usual roar of morning traffic. Inside the clinic, the air felt stale. Leo sat at Harrison's cluttered desk, nursing a cup of instant coffee that tasted like burnt battery acid. He was reviewing supply manifests on a tablet, forcing his brain to focus on the logistics of his legitimate businesses, the shipping lanes, the waste management contracts. It was an exercise in futility. His mind kept drifting to the metal cot in the next room. Clara had been awake for 3 hours. She hadn't spoken another word to him since his declaration. She just lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling tiles, a silent, rigid statue of terror and despair. The silence was shattered by the jarring ring of the clinic's landline. Harrison, who was checking Clara's bandages, jumped. Leo was out of his chair before the second ring. He picked up the heavy plastic receiver. "Yeah, boss." It was Frankie. The underlying tremor in his usually stoic voice made the hair on the back of Leo's neck stand up. "We got a situation." "Report." "The warehouse down on 4th, the import-export front." Frankie paused, swallowing hard. "It's gone, Leo. Blew to high heaven about 10 minutes ago. Fire department is on scene, but there's nothing left. 2 of our night watchmen were inside." Leo squeezed the phone handle until the plastic creaked. His face remained completely impassive, a mask of stone. "Victor." "Has to be," Frankie said. "Nobody else has the brass to hit a Rossi warehouse like that. He's escalating, fast. The capos are panicking. They want a meeting. Set it up. My restaurant. Noon." Leo's voice was mechanical. "Lock down the perimeter. Move the family to the compound upstate. Nobody travels without a 4-man escort." "What about you, boss?" "Where are you?" "I'm managing an asset," Leo said coldly. "I'll be there." He hung up the phone. The click was loud in the small office. He walked to the doorway of the examination room. Clara was watching him, her good eye tracking his movements. She had heard enough of his side of the conversation to put the pieces together. "He's coming for you," Clara said. Her voice wasn't gloating. It was hollow. "Because of me." "He's coming for me because he wants my chair," Leo corrected sharply. "You were just the excuse he needed to start shooting." Clara tried to push herself up on her elbows. She winced, biting her lip so hard it started bleeding again. "Then let us go. If I'm the excuse, remove it. Give me back to him." Leo stepped into the room, his physical presence dominating the cramped space. "Do you think handing you over stops a war? It just shows him I bleed when cut. It shows weakness." "I don't care about your pride," Clara suddenly yelled, the raw emotion tearing at her vocal cords. "I care about my daughter. If you keep us here, we're collateral damage. If you let us run, maybe we have a chance." She swung her legs over the side of the cot, her bare feet hitting the cold linoleum. Her knees buckled instantly. Leo moved with terrifying speed. He caught her before she hit the floor, his strong hands gripping her waist. The physical contact was jarring. She felt incredibly fragile, her body burning with residual heat, her muscles trembling violently against his grip. "Let go of me," she sobbed, thrashing weakly against his chest. her hands curled into fists, weakly pounding against his ruined dress shirt. "You're all monsters. You, Victor. All of you. Just let me take my baby and run." Leo didn't let go. He absorbed her weak blows, his face inches from her dark hair. She smelled of fever sweat, cheap soap, and profound desperation. He felt a sickening twist in his gut, a crack in the armor he had worn for 20 years. He shifted his grip, wrapping one arm firmly around her back to support her weight, and used his other hand to gently but firmly grasp her chin, forcing her to look up at him. "Listen to me," Leo said, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. "You run now. You make it 3 blocks before his spotters find you. They won't just kill you in an alley this time. They'll make an example of you. And Lily." Clara froze at the mention of her daughter's name. A fresh wave of tears spilled down her bruised cheeks. She slumped against him, all the fight draining out of her, leaving only exhaustion and defeat. Leo held her. It was an incredibly awkward posture for a man entirely unaccustomed to providing comfort. He stood stiffly in the middle of a dirty veterinary clinic, holding a weeping woman who owed his syndicate money, feeling the dampness of her tears soaking through his thin shirt. "I'll fix this," Leo murmured, the words slipping out before his brain could filter them. It wasn't a calculated promise. It was a visceral reaction. Clara slowly pulled back, leaning heavily on his arm. She looked at him, searching his dark, guarded eyes for a trap. Why? Why would you risk everything you have for a mistake? Leo looked away. He looked at the peeling paint on the wall. "Because I've spent my whole life building an empire in the dark, and for once, I want to decide who gets to see the sun." He gently guided her back onto the cot. He pulled a blanket up over her shaking shoulders. "Rest," he commanded, stepping back, instantly rebuilding the invisible wall between them. "I have a meeting. Harrison is going to lock the heavy doors. Do not open them for anyone, not even the police." He grabbed a heavy wool overcoat from the back of a chair, sliding it on over his rumpled clothes. He checked the action on his Smith & Wesson one last time, the metallic click harsh and reassuring. As he walked past the waiting area, Lily was sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing on a piece of scrap paper with a stubby crayon. She didn't look up. "Lock it behind me, Doc," Leo said to Harrison, who was hovering nervously by the door. Leo stepped out into the misty morning. The cold air hit his lungs like shattered glass. The smell of the city, exhaust, wet pavement, rotting garbage, filled his nose. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of war. He walked toward the Lincoln, his mind already calculating the brutal arithmetic of the hours ahead. Blood would have to be spent to balance the ledger. But as he grasped the cold handle of the car door, he realized his internal calculus had shifted. For the first time in his reign, the blood wasn't just about protecting territory. It was about protecting a promise he had no right to make. Cigar smoke hung thick and heavy over the mahogany table in the back room of Toscano's. It smelled of burnt leaves, aged rum, and expensive arrogance. Leo sat at the head of the table, his face a mask carved from granite. Before him sat the 4 capos of his family. Angelo picked at a plate of cold veal, Carmine chain-smoked, and Victor sat leaning back in his leather chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Victor looked entirely too comfortable for a man who had just blown up $1 million of syndicate infrastructure. "We are bleeding, Leo," Carmine rasped, crushing a cigarette into a glass ashtray. "The warehouse is gone. The Port Authority is asking questions. We need a response, not a sit-down." "A response requires knowing exactly who lit the match," Leo said smoothly. His dark eyes flicked to Victor. "Isn't that right, Victor?" Victor chuckled. It was a wet, arrogant sound. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Rumors are dangerous things, boss. Word on the street is you lost your mind over a piece of skirt. Burned my counting house. Broke my men. People are saying you're weak, distracted." The room went dead silent. "You didn't call the boss of the Rossi family weak to his face, unless you already had the votes to bury him." Leo felt the cold calculus of betrayal click into place. He looked at Angelo. Angelo looked away, suddenly intensely interested in his water glass. Carmine lit another cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. Victor had already bought them. The meeting wasn't a negotiation. It was an ambush. "Loyalty," Leo murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The low frequency of it made the hair on Frankie's arms stand up. Frankie shifted his weight behind Leo, his hand hovering near his jacket lapel. "It's a funny currency, depreciates faster than the dollar." "Step down, Leo," Victor said flatly, dropping the pretense. "Take your retirement. Take the woman. Leave the city. The commission will accept a peaceful transition." Leo looked at the half-empty glass of scotch in front of him. The amber liquid caught the dim overhead light. He thought about the cold basement clinic. He thought about a little girl in yellow boots offering him a stale cracker. He thought about Clara, trembling against his chest, smelling of fear and vanilla. He had spent his life building this empire, only to realize he despised the men who populated it. "You think I broke your men over a woman?" Leo asked softly, finally looking up. His eyes were completely dead. "I broke them because they forgot who owns the streets they walk on. I broke them because you forgot." Victor scoffed, pushing his chair back. "You're delusional. You don't have the numbers to—" Leo didn't draw the heavy Smith & Wesson. It was too slow for this range. Instead, his hand shot across the table, grabbing the heavy crystal decanter of scotch. In one fluid, violent motion, he smashed it directly into the side of Victor's head. The glass shattered with a sickening crunch. Scotch and blood sprayed across the mahogany. Victor screamed, clutching his face as he toppled backward out of his chair. Chaos erupted. Angelo scrambled back. Carmine dropped his cigarette. Two of Victor's bodyguards lunged forward from the door, but Frankie was already firing. Two suppressed coughs from Frankie's Glock dropped them before they cleared leather. Leo stood up. He walked slowly around the table, the crunch of broken crystal under his shoes sounding like marching steps. Victor was thrashing on the floor, blood pouring from a jagged laceration above his ear. Leo planted his heavy shoes squarely on Victor's chest, pinning him down. He drew the Smith & Wesson, thumbing the hammer back. The mechanical click silenced the room entirely. "The transition," Leo said, looking down at the bleeding capo, "is cancelled." He didn't pull the trigger. Killing a capo in front of the others without a formal commission vote was bad business. It would turn a civil war into a bloodbath. He lifted his foot and stepped back. "Frankie," Leo barked, not taking his eyes off the terrified men at the table. "Burn Victor's businesses. All of them. The slaughterhouses, the clubs, the loan offices. If a building has his name on the deed, I want it in ashes by midnight. Any man who stands with him goes into the ground." He turned and walked toward the door, his suit ruined with another man's blood. The itch behind his ribs was back, hot and demanding. He needed to get back to the clinic. Rain washed the blood from the hood of the armored Lincoln as Leo drove erratically through the twisting streets. His left arm hung uselessly at his side. A mile from the restaurant, one of Victor's surviving street crews had ambushed the car. The bulletproof glass held, but a ricochet through an open window had caught Leo in the bicep. It burned, a deep, searing fire that made his vision blur at the edges. He dumped the car in the alley behind the clinic, practically falling out of the driver's seat. He stumbled heavily against the brick wall, leaving a wet, red smear. The night air was freezing, but he was sweating profusely. He banged his good hand against the heavy steel door. "Doc, open up!" The deadbolts threw back with a heavy clank. Doc Harrison stood there, pale and disheveled. He took one look at Leo's arm and grabbed him by the lapels, hauling him inside. "Jesus, Leo, you're painting my floor." "Fix it," Leo grunted, collapsing onto a rolling stool in the main examination room. He looked up. Clara was standing in the doorway of the recovery room. She looked healthier. The pale, waxy sheen was gone, replaced by the natural, olive tone of her skin. Her bruised eye was still swollen, but the terror that had dominated her expression was replaced by something else. Shock, and a strange, hesitant concern. "Doc's hands are shaking," Clara noted, stepping into the harsh fluorescent light. It was true. Harrison had been hitting the bottle while Leo was gone. The vet tried to rip open a sterile gauze packet, his fingers fumbling uselessly. "Get out of the way," Clara said, her voice surprisingly firm. She gently pushed the doctor aside. She didn't flinch at the sight of the blood soaking Leo's sleeve. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears from the metal tray and began cutting the expensive wool of his suit coat away, exposing the torn, bleeding flesh of his arm. Leo watched her. He felt a bizarre disconnect from the pain. Her hands were surprisingly gentle. She smelled like the cheap, pink hand soap from Harrison's bathroom, mixed with the lingering scent of vanilla. It was an incredibly domestic smell in an incredibly violent room. "Why did you come back?" she asked softly, her eyes focused entirely on the wound. She poured a generous splash of antiseptic directly onto the torn muscle. Leo hissed through his teeth, his jaw locking. "I told you, you belong to me until I say otherwise." Clara paused, pressing a thick pad of gauze firmly against the bleeding hole. She leaned closer to apply pressure. Her breath hitched slightly. "That's a lie. You could have stashed us anywhere. You came back because you were bleeding. And because—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The air between them was thick with a messy, unspoken gravity. Leo looked at her mouth, at the split lip that was finally beginning to heal. He felt an overwhelming, irrational urge to pull her closer, to bury his face in her neck and forget the city burning outside. "You're an idiot," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "You're a violent, arrogant idiot." "I know," Leo murmured. He reached up with his good hand and gently cupped the side of her face, his thumb brushing carefully beneath her bruised eye. She closed her good eye, leaning into the touch for just a fraction of a second. It was a fleeting, raw concession. A silent acknowledgement that they were both broken things, hiding in a basement while the world tore itself apart. Small footsteps padded into the room. Lily stood there, dragging her stuffed rabbit by the ear. She looked at Leo's bloody arm, then at his face. She walked over and silently placed the battered rabbit onto his knee. "For the pain," the little girl said solemnly. Leo stared at the toy. He swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat that felt like swallowed glass. He gently rested his massive, bruised hand on the top of Lily's head. "Thanks, kid. Gunpowder smells like burnt ozone and crushed stone." It was a scent Leo knew intimately, and it hung heavy in the air of the abandoned subway terminal. It was 3 days later. The war had been short, brutal, and definitive. Frankie's crews had decimated Victor's operations. The commission, smelling the shift in the wind, officially sanctioned Victor's removal. But Victor had run. He had tried to rat, attempting to trade Rossi secrets to the feds in exchange for immunity. Leo found him first. Water dripped from the vaulted ceiling of the tunnel, echoing loudly. Victor was backed against a rusted subway car, clutching a briefcase full of dirty cash. He looked nothing like the arrogant capo from the restaurant. He was dirty, exhausted, and terrified. Leo, Victor pleaded, holding a hand up. We can make a deal. I have offshore accounts. I can disappear. You'll never see me again. Leo walked forward slowly. His left arm was in a black sling, resting tightly against his chest. His right hand held the Smith & Wesson. You threatened what was mine, Leo said, his voice flat, echoing down the empty tunnel. She was a nobody, Victor screamed, his composure shattering. A two-bit widow with a debt. You burned the family down for a stray. She wasn't a nobody to me, Leo said. He didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a final cinematic speech. He raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, a brief flash of orange illuminating the grim darkness. Victor slumped against the rusted metal, sliding down to the dirty concrete floor. The ledger was closed. An hour later, Leo walked down the steps into Harrison's basement clinic. The harsh fluorescent lights had finally been fixed, humming with a steady, quiet drone. Clara was packing a small canvas duffel bag. Lily was sitting on a dog bed, fully dressed in her yellow raincoat, her boots laced up. Leo walked to the metal examination table. He tossed a thick manila envelope onto it. It hit the stainless steel with a heavy thud. Passports, clean identities. 50,000 in cash, Leo said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He wouldn't look at her. There's a car waiting out back. Driver will take you to an airfield. Private charter to Montreal. Victor is dead. His ledger burned. Nobody is looking for you. Clara stopped packing. She looked at the envelope. She looked at the door. Then she looked at Leo. He stood there, battered, his arm in a sling, his expensive coat ruined again. He was a monster who orchestrated death. He was the darkness of the city given flesh. But he was also the man who had bled onto this very floor to keep her breathing. She walked over to the table. She picked up the thick envelope. She weighed it in her hands. Montreal, she said softly. It's quiet there, Leo replied, staring at a crack in the linoleum. You can open a bakery. The kid can go to a real school. It's safe. Clara walked slowly toward him. She stopped inches away, her presence invading his guarded space. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing the lapel of his coat. I don't know how to live in a quiet place anymore, Leo, she whispered. Leo finally looked up. His dark eyes met hers. The tension between them was electric, crackling with danger and an agonizing, undeniable pull. The life I lead. Leo's voice was rough, struggling for control. It's ugly, Clara. It will pull you under. It will stain that kid. We're already stained, she said fiercely, her hand moving up to rest flat against his chest, right over his pounding heart. But when the monsters came for us, you were the only one who stood in the way. She stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. She reached up, pulling his head down slightly, and pressed her lips against his. It wasn't a soft, romantic kiss. It was desperate. It was raw. It tasted of stale coffee, antiseptic, and survival. Leo groaned, his good arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her fiercely against him. He kissed her back with a hungry, protective violence, burying his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of vanilla that had anchored him through the blood and the fire. He knew it was a mistake. He knew keeping her close was the most dangerous thing he could possibly do. But as he held her in the dim light of the basement, listening to the rain pounding against the pavement above, Leo Rossi finally accepted the truth. He was the devil of this city. But he had finally found his queen. If you felt the tension in every raindrop and the weight of Leo's impossible choice, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like button, share this gritty story with your friends who love dark, deeply emotional mafia dramas, and subscribe to the channel for the next thrilling chapters. The war is over. but the dangerous romance is just beginning. Drop a comment below. Did Clara make the right choice, staying with the beast? Or should she have run to Montreal? Stay tuned for more gripping stories. Subscribe now